In Colombia, the nationwide demonstrations against the government of Iván Duque continued for the 15th day this Wednesday, despite the heavy state repression. An intervention study in the population with vaccine candidates Abdala and Soberana02 continues in Cuba. The Israeli attacks on Palestinian civilians in the occupied East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip continue, having caused at least 67 deaths. From the headquarters of teleSUR English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South. I'm Gladys Quesada. In Colombia, the mobilizations called by the National Strike Committee continued this Wednesday, following the failure of talks with President Iván Duque due to his government's refusal to hear the population's demands. The National Strike Committee called for a new nationwide mobilization on Wednesday, following the failed talks on Monday, during which President Duque refused to acknowledge the violent situation in the country due to the excessive use of force by state security forces, killing, abusing and arresting peaceful protesters. The latest strike action seeks to demand the withdrawal of the government's neoliberal economic reforms and negotiate an emergency plan to address the pandemic. Likewise, protesters noted that the president's lack of empathy towards the more than 1,000 victims of acts of police brutality that have been reported since the beginning of the peaceful demonstrations. And people mobilized across Colombia this Wednesday as the anti-government protests show no sign of stopping after 15 days, despite the heavy state repression. Groups of people gather in different parts of the capital, Bogota, from the early hours to carry out sit-ins and other demonstrations. The city of Cali is also carrying out massive mobilizations in rejection of police violence and against the social crisis that the city is experiencing. Meanwhile, collectives and organizations in Barranquilla and Bucaramanga joined the mobilizations against Duque's neoliberal policies. Other cities across the nation saw the population mobilize against police repression, the humanitarian crisis, and also the ongoing assassinations of social, community and indigenous leaders, and also trade unionists. Students and indigenous groups painted a symbolic Misak Avenue on a street in the Colombian capital, Bogota, this Wednesday, which is named after the conquistador Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada, who founded the city. The move was an attempt to counteract the structural systemic erasure of memory, according to an indigenous leaders. Members of the Misak indigenous community toppled a statue of the colonizer in the square next to the street of May the 7th.
The reason for this is to counteract the structural, systemic erasure of memory that has taken place in Colombia. For example, education has hijacked the possibility of a real history of the original peoples.
At this moment, it would be very nice to honor this avenue, which will no longer be called Jimenez Avenue, but Misak Avenue, because after all, the indigenous people are also the ones who have been in the territory for the longest time.
The president of the Confederation of Workers of Colombia, Francisco Maltes, expressed his satisfaction with the national mobilizations seen this Wednesday across Colombia, as thousands took to the streets to voice their opposition to the government of President Iván Duque, his neoliberal agenda, and the repression unleashed by state security forces against peaceful protesters.
Excellent mobilizations on May the 12th to express our outrage, our voice of rejection of the policies of President Iván Duque. Hundreds, thousands, millions of people peacefully mobilized throughout the country to express our disagreement. Congratulations to the Colombian people, young people, workers, teachers, state employees, indigenous, black, Afro-Colombians, farmers, LGTB community that have mobilized to express their outrage. The strike continues as long as there are no guarantees for negotiation. The guarantees are to end, stop the massacre, demilitarize the social protest, that the anti-riot squadron ceases to have lethal weapons in the mobilizations, and of course, the President of the Republic must condemn the massacre and the atrocities that have been carried out against young people in our country. The strike continues.
Outgoing President of Ecuador, Lenín Moreno, introduced a market-based price for gasoline and diesel in the middle of an economic crisis worsened by the COVID-19 pandemic. The government established a band system around the future price of West Texas Intermediate crude, with monthly reviews conducted jointly by the oil and finance ministries. Fuel prices will be regulated by this system, which increased oil prices between 3 and 5% since July 2020. The state company Petroecuador confirmed that the prices of extra fuel and extra fuel with ethanol will cost a maximum of $1.99 per gallon, while premium and regular diesel will cost $1.48 per gallon. The measure was rejected by transport workers in the capital, who in the last few days have pressured the government to demand an increase in bus fares in order to cover the new fuel cost. In Venezuela, President Nicolas Maduro declared his willingness to engage in dialogue with local opposition factors and with the mediation of the European Union, as well as the government of Norway and members of the contact group.
I agree with the European Union's help, with the government of Norway, the contact group, when you want, where you want, and how you want, ready to meet with all the opposition to see what could happen in the meeting. If something good comes out and they abandon the path of the war, invasion, attacks, coup d'etats, and come to the electoral path, here we await them on the electoral path, the proposal approved.
In Chile, the electoral campaign ahead of the regional, municipal, and constitutional convention elections this weekend is drawing to a close. Final campaign events were held in the south of the country this Wednesday for candidates seeking to form part of the Constitutional Convention, the body that will be in charge of drafting the country's new constitution to replace that which was established under the Pinochet dictatorship. The convention's 155 seats will include indigenous representatives and also ensure gender parity in the drafting of the new constitution. Campaign activities and the elections themselves were suspended for several weeks due to the COVID-19 pandemic. On May 15th and 16th, Chileans will go to the polls to elect the members of the Constitutional Convention, as well as governors, mayors, and council members. This Wednesday, Argentina's Senate debated a bill that will authorize the president and provincial governors to issue restrictions in the framework of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Senate Constitutional Affairs and Health Committees, meeting in a virtual plenary session, approved the bill with no modifications. The bill will now be debated next week in a special plenary session of the Senate, with the intention of being quickly forwarded to the Chamber of Deputies for its approval, in order to become law by May the 22nd, when the current necessity and urgency decree signed by President Alberto Fernandez on restrictions to contain the pandemic will expire. The government proposal suggests guidelines for the entire country, including preventive measures such as the mandatory use of masks and classification of different areas according to the epidemiological risk. And we'll be right back after this very short break, so don't go away.
It is our duty to reverse the damage we cause to the planet. Let's recover our natural ecosystems with actions in defense of the environment. Let's keep fighting for a greener world. Wednesdays, only on teleSUR. We share your feelings, exalt your accomplishments, and show your reality. Our approach is global and keeps us in tune with the peoples. Caribbean countries also get our signal. With enthusiasm, we will continue to broadcast for them. Because we are teleSUR, the news broadcaster from South America and the Caribbean. Innovation, science, the technological breakthrough and its influence in society.
Viajeros del saber, el futuro está aquí.
Atomen. Monday, only on teleSUR.
Welcome back From the South. This Wednesday in Cuba, the intervention study in the population using vaccine candidates Abdala and Soberana02 continued. The study that began on May 11th will include in its first stage health workers and medical students, as well as other risk groups. According to information provided by health authorities, doses of the Abdala vaccine candidate have already been distributed in the western provinces of the country to be administered to all eligible people. In the capital, Abdala will be applied in 7 municipalities, while Soberana02 will be administered in the other 8. People older than 19 years old will be able to participate in the intervention study, whereas pregnant women, those who are breastfeeding, and people with high blood pressure won't receive the jabs. On Wednesday, Thailand's Department of Corrections reported that nearly 3,000 inmates and officials in 2 prisons have tested positive for COVID-19. The department announced the infections after a prominent political activist released on bail last week announced that she had tested positive for the virus. The authorities said they had performed proactive testing among 100% of officials and inmates and found people infected with COVID-19 in the Central Women's Correctional Institution and also the Bangkok Remand Prison. The country faces a complicated health situation with nearly 2,000 confirmed cases reported in the past 24 hours. The new coronavirus wave that began at the beginning of April accounts for about 2/3 of all confirmed cases and more than 3/4 of the deaths. On Wednesday, India's coronavirus death toll surpassed 250,000 as the pandemic continues to rage across the country of 1.3 billion people, official data showed. Anant Ban, an independent health policy and bioethics researcher, warned that the official numbers of people dying due to COVID in India are an underestimate. Meanwhile, as the outbreak is easing in major cities, the virus appears to be running unchecked in India's vast rural hinterland, where 2/3 of its people live. According to the Health Ministry, 4,200 people died in the past 24 hours. At the same time, the number of confirmed cases rose by almost 350,000 to 23.3 million, the second highest figure in the world after the United States. And Norway will not resume the use of COVID-19 vaccines made by AstraZeneca, while a decision on whether to start using inoculations made by Johnson & Johnson remains on hold, Prime Minister Erna Solberg said on Wednesday. Solberg said the decision had been taken in view of the rare but serious side effects associated with the jabs, which both use the same adenovirus technology. The Johnson & Johnson jab will remain suspended, but the government will offer the single-dose vaccine to those who want it voluntarily. AstraZeneca said it was awaiting the Norwegian government's final decision. Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni, one of Africa's longest-serving rulers, was sworn in for a 6th term in office this Wednesday, following his victory at the polls in January. Museveni, who's been in power for the past 34 years, took the oath in Kampala at a ceremony that was broadcasted on national television. According to the official results, the president obtained 58% of the vote during the January 14th elections, which were denounced as a masquerade by his main opponent, Bobi Wine, who secured 35% of ballots. The ceremony was attended by 11 African heads of state, those of Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Somalia, Burundi, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ghana, South Sudan, Guinea, and Namibia, as well as Chinese and Russian representatives.
It is, therefore, quite comic and laughable to hear of some actors in the world giving us lectures about democracy. You give me a lecture about democracy? What are your own credentials? We designed this system not from air-conditioned rooms, but from the jungles of our country, where we lived with the people, in their huts in those days, for much of the 16 years of the resistance. We have, since long time ago, stated that African patriots, like we in the national resistance movement, are neither pro-West nor pro-East. We are first and foremost pro-Africa.
In the Ivory Coast, police rescued 68 people, and children also, forced to work on farms in a cocoa producing center in the southwestern region of Subre. The director of child protection at the Ministry of Women's Affairs announced that the police operation determined most of the children were trafficked from neighboring Burkina Faso. The official explained that the applicable procedures in these cases will be carried out by the corresponding authorities, and the children will be returned to their families. The West African country is the world's top cocoa producer and has close to 1 million children working in the sector, despite years of efforts to end child labor. Syrian authorities received Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif on Wednesday, who visited Syria to discuss issues of importance to the region, including the violence unleashed by Israel in the Gaza Strip. Zarif expressed his joy to be back in Damascus and meet with the Syrian people. The Iranian diplomat noted that during his visit he will ratify Iran's support to the Syrian government in its fight against terrorists and in its reconstruction of the country. The Syrian Minister of Foreign Affairs and expatriate Faisal Mekdad stressed that the important visit by his Iranian counterpart comes at a delicate time when the progressive Western, US and Israeli policies against both countries are intensifying. And we have more stories coming up after this final short break, so stay with us.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Sean todos muy bienvenidos a Vidas. Hay lugares donde el arte se unifica con el orgullo de los pueblos. Y esos lugares están llenos de colores, alegría, pasión, tradiciones, arraigo, valor y entrega.
Real Life. Fridays. Only on teleSUR.
Una travesía para descubrirnos. Buscamos conexiones perdidas.
No nos queda otra que luchar, porque no tenemos nada que perder.
Realmente es por todos.
Recorremos el mundo con Reportajes teleSUR.
Saturdays. Only on teleSUR. Innovation, science, the technological breakthrough and its influence in society.
Viajeros del saber, el futuro está aquí.
Atomy. Monday, only on teleSUR.
Welcome back from the south. Israel has continued bombing the Gaza Strip this Wednesday, targeting civilians and residential buildings, having killed at least 67 Palestinians, including 17 children, and wounding hundreds of others. Israel has waged hundreds of airstrikes since Monday on the besieged Gaza Strip. A Palestinian news agency correspondent said an Israeli warplane fired 9 missiles at a 14-story tower in Rimal, neighborhood west of Gaza City, completely destroying it as hundreds of Palestinians living in the world's largest open-air prison lose their homes and their loved ones. International Criminal Court prosecutor Fatou Bensouda said this Wednesday that the Israeli escalation of violence against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank and the East Jerusalem could amount to crimes under the Rome Statute. The ICC is currently investigating Israeli war crimes against Palestinians. As the Palestinian resistance movement mobilizes, the Israeli defense minister said that this is just the beginning and warned that buildings will continue to crumble. Meanwhile, Zionists have upped their attacks on Palestinian Arabs and their properties in major cities inside Israel, including Jaffa and Lida. Israelis also attempted to vandalize mosques in both cities, seeking to set them on fire before residents clash with them and force them to run away. The United Nations Security Council held another emergency meeting this Wednesday on the worsening attacks of Israel against Palestinians, again without agreeing on a joint statement due to opposition from the United States, Israel's key ally, according to diplomats.
We express our grave concern regarding the escalation in and around Gaza and the upsurge in violence in the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory, including in East Jerusalem, as well as in Israel. We urgently call upon all actors to de-escalate tensions, end violence, and show the utmost restraint. The situation with regard to the threatened evictions of Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah and other areas of East Jerusalem is also of serious concern. We call on Israel to cease settlement activities, demolitions and evictions, including in East Jerusalem, in line with its obligations under international humanitarian law.
The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov called for an urgent meeting of the Middle East Quartet this Wednesday as the Israeli violence against Palestinians escalates. The statements came following the minister's meeting with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who supported Lavrov's recommendation to organize such a meeting at the ministerial level.
The Secretary General, as the coordinator of the quartet, will try, whilst working with the parties, to organize this meeting as soon as possible. It would be best to organize such a meeting at the ministerial level.
Meanwhile, the UN Secretary General underlined the organization's commitment to revitalizing the quartet, to work towards de-escalation and also the resumption of the peace process in the Middle East.
We are totally committed to revitalizing the quartet. We are totally committed to promote all forms of dialogue by the parties and by other key actors that can be supportive of all démarches necessary for de-escalation, but also for the revitalization of a peace process that has been dormant for too much time. The recent incidents demonstrate how important it is to restart effectively the peace process, because it's the only way.
Members from the Chicago Coalition for Justice in Palestine organized a rally this Wednesday to denounce the escalation of Israeli attacks that have killed dozens of Palestinians in Gaza, as civilians are deliberately targeted. The Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America People's Trade Treaty issued a statement condemning the Israeli military attacks on the Palestinian people.
The Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America People's Trade Treaty strongly condemns the criminal Israeli military aggressions against the Palestinian people, causing at least the death of 48 civilians, including children, and more than 300 wounded, as a result of Israeli attacks in the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem. The violence triggered by the Israeli authorities in the middle of Ramadan and the threat of evictions of Palestinian families in the east of the Holy City. ALBA-TCP also condemns and regrets the death of Israeli civilians. ALBA-TCP hereby reaffirms its support for the sovereignty, independence, and self-determination of the Palestinian people and calls on those who perpetuate the occupation to cease their actions, to respect international law and the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations. The Alliance demands the enforcement of the relevant resolutions of the United Nations and reiterates that the only solution acceptable to the international community is the two-state solution, based on the existing borders prior to 1967, and with East Jerusalem as the capital of the State of Palestine. The Alliance conveys its sympathy to the victims and relatives affected by the attacks, condemns this new wave of violence, and based on its deep vocation for peace, urges the United Nations to adopt urgent measures in order to promote a peaceful, comprehensive, fair, and lasting solution.
And we have come to the end of this news brief, but we finish with Pink Floyd's Song for Palestine as the apartheid state of Israel continues its criminal attacks. Remember, you can find this and many other stories on our website and our social media pages. For teleSUR English, I'm Gladys Quesada. Thank you for watching.